Alright everyone, it's time for a little bit of a history refresher because a lot of people seem to have misunderstood the history of the United States insofar as where its wealth came from. They seem to think the United States was built by slaves, like skyscrapers are made out of cotton, and this simply is not the case. First and foremost, I'll just point this out. Plantation agriculture, this is pretty much objectively understood, held back the South. When you have an agrarian economy that's run at very low efficiency because you're essentially just using manpower, slaves in that essence, to do everything, and holding back initially on bothering to industrialize at all because, you know, you can just make more slaves by letting people do what they do, which is have sex. When you refuse to use the cotton gin, that tends to hold back the development. The northern states, by and large, never had this problem. By the way, you can actually look at areas in the north that had slavery prior to the Missouri Compromise, and they suffer from similar crises in the more agricultural areas that elements of the Deep South do outside of the coast. Of course, having a coast for trade purposes, especially post late 19th century, tends to be an advantage, and then you get the Rust Belt develop and stuff, because central planning and economics can be a little bit interesting. Look at the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era. But slavery did not build the United States. Leftists are trying to claim that basically the reason why I have reasonable wealth is because slaves suffered and were whipped back in the 1800s. The problem is, by and large, the North never had slavery, and economically is, by the way, better off for it because it industrialized earlier. With exceptions. There were a few states in the North, again, prior to the Missouri Compromise, that did have slavery, and in fact, the North didn't abolish slavery in those states until after the Civil War. Emancipation only dealt with slaves in the South, mainly to get them to flee north to fight for the Union because they wanted more manpower, and they said, hey, northern white people are starting to get tired of this fucking war. Well, we need to do something. Oh, well, we'll draft black people. See, the average white northerner didn't care if they went off to die. They said, oh, how patriotic. They're fighting for their brethren to be freed, because they framed it as a slave debate, even though it had more to do with, in the minds of the Southerners at least, had more to do with state sovereignty. The 10th Amendment, hating Lincoln. But skyscrapers are not made out of cotton. To be clear, the industrial advantage that the United States gained largely left the South behind because of agrarian plantation agriculture. And Southern slave owners essentially were quasi-socialistic in some ways. Think about it this way. Southern plantation owners actively endeavored to prevent the development of key industries down there in order to maintain their livelihood. They drove wages down among free white workers as well as other groups of people through the use of slavery. Ironically, the South's problems are more rooted in leftism than anything else. There's a reason why the Southern Dems were the Jim Crow Party. By the way, gun control comes from the Jim Crow era with the Cruikshank decision. It's interesting how all of these things hook together, again, among people who initially at least pretended that they were fighting for states' rights. And it was, by the way, pretense. The plantation owners that organized things, they cared a little bit less about that than their own personal fortunes. The average small-time white person in the South didn't own any slaves anyway. But the North was the seed of that industry, really, and electrification and the big rail and all of these things sort of originate there. They bypassed the South initially. Now, later on, of course, that's not the case. The South now is more developed, but there are still a lot of agrarian areas down there that have lingering problems, including among white communities, which is why we can say it's had nothing to do with slavery. The reason why there was perpetual poverty generation after generation wasn't even fully due to Jim Crow. It was due to infrastructure issues. If you've got an area of farmland, you're probably not going to have the same developments in there as cities. And there weren't as many cities down there. There was a lot of tobacco fields and cotton and so forth. It's funny. Under Jim Crow, after slavery ends, you get only a semi-decentralization of that same labor. Again, for several more generations, the economic problems remain. Really, the United States, fundamentally, before the Civil War, before federalization was a big thing, it was built mainly by just people exploring, finding resources, and extracting them. A lot of those happened to be in the North, coal especially initially, but Pennsylvania, Ohio, and so forth. That was a big one because it was powering the whole world at the time. and you get industry and stuff, and naturally that industry tended to concentrate in big cities, which were simply more profuse in the north. That has nothing to do with slavery or the absence, but it has. But again, the development there wasn't due to people being enslaved. If anything, Irish indentured servants played a bigger role. You see the same kind of labor, prior to the Progressive Era, in the early, skyscraper Gilded Age. You see this, but again, it's big cities. There weren't that many in the South. You have Atlanta, a big city, huge now. And you have Tampa and Houston and a few of these others, but the North really, at the time, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, D.C., some of these areas was big. Baltimore certainly was bigger. It's funny because Vermont was an industrial powerhouse at the turn of the 20th century. Hell, it was 90% deforested. Most people don't realize you go to Vermont, you see all the trees, you think it's like old growth and stuff, like some ancient forest. It's actually all from within the last 100 years for the most part, below the snow line on the peaks of the mountains. That's because they were farming animals. They had beef production and milk. They had initially wool, actually, textiles. And that's why you have all those old woolen mill towers everywhere that the tourists like to gawk at, because they tend to tower over everything else Vermonters have ever built, other than the Bennington Battle Monument. The South was held back by this, and then post-Civil War, the prosperity comes from the Homestead Act, and from the uniting of the coasts and industrial projects. Again, the Transcontinental Railroad and the homesteading that happened in what is now the Midwest and parts of the Old West, the Dakotas, Montana and stuff, that has nothing to do with slavery. Had nothing to do with Jim Crow in many cases. A lot of these places didn't really have segregation either. And Cruikshank broadly applied, but in the South was mainly where that was enforced. If I look at areas of the United States that have more systemic poverty, there's a significant correlation with states that for 100 years held themselves back by having this wage-adjusted population that was automatically going to be better for menial labor, thus forcing potentially poor white people out of a job entirely. We see this today with illegal immigration that held itself back prior with plantation agriculture. And part of that is not even necessarily, other than the centralization aspect, the plantation owner having basically a handful of serf white people and then a bunch of slaves, really, there are large areas of the South that aren't good for anything other than agriculture. And there are some parts of the North that are the same, although the climate in the South is better if you're growing tobacco or something. There were no other resources to extract. But the fact is, slavery still held it back. The development that happens thereafter is largely post-slavery in some of these cities and outlying areas. And of course, transportation is a problem too, and things change economically once you get the automobile and the modern road system. That certainly, it's a far cry from the horse and buggy. But slavery did not build skyscrapers. In fact, slavery kept them from being built in many areas because it was simply inefficient. And it was guaranteed to end too. When people say, well, the South would have held on to slavery forever if they had won, I doubt it. I honestly doubt that they wouldn't have abolished it within a couple of decades because of the Industrial Revolution. That's what would have ended up happening because there's no purpose to it. It boiled down to economics in the minds of many. There was an open abolitionist debate in the South, actually, including among some of the gentry down south that didn't involve themselves with slavery, some of the old money families, landed gentry. There was an open debate over it. Many people were members of the same, in the South I'm talking about, were members of, or at least sympathizers of, the same ideology Lincoln was part of that established Liberia and encouraged freed slaves to go back to what they imagined was their homeland. Now, of course, the funny part is many of them were not from anywhere near Liberia. But again, they were trying to be reformist, but they didn't really understand, I guess, geography. And the Europeans had begun to carve Africa up, so they're like, where are we? We'll just establish this one little colony here. This is fundamentally U.S. territorial for a while. Little U.S. annex. By the way, Liberia, one of the more dysfunctional nations within the region. I wonder why, and there's plenty of slavery there still, I'm sure, to this day, as there are in many parts of the world. And where it's found, if you look at slavery today, why is it that it overlaps with impoverished areas? If slavery builds up so much wealth for people, then why aren't we seeing that today? Oh, there's like 1 billion slaves in the world. There's more slaves in the world now than there were in the 1860s. The world, these countries like Burma, there's a lot of slavery. China has a lot of slavery, and yet it has massive amounts of poverty in the outlying areas. There's lots of slavery in North Africa. Libya, half the population are slaves. Why is Libya not flush with gold? A lot of slaves. There's plenty of slaves in Colombia, in Honduras. Why do people from those countries keep trying to come here where there's no slavery? I thought that it built wealth and shit. So that's because it doesn't. It actually holds things back. It's a relic. It's a Stone Age relic. That's about all. Peace out.